Today's conversation is really talking about our messy first try at participatory design. So we're going to be pretty candid in sharing our successes, our failures, and the things that we still have questions about. And we're coming with some vulnerability because we hope it helps make participatory design feel a little bit more within reach for all of you who might be in other government agencies across the country. So cool. We're all operating from the same definition. This is what we think of when we use the term participatory design. Participatory design is built on the principles of collaboration, co-creation, and empowerment. Users are contributing to the design process, which allows them to provide feedback, suggest ideas, and participate in decision-making. The goal here is to create products and services that accommodate users' needs and help them achieve their objectives. And I know for myself, and I think Swetha as well, maybe you too who are listening, you've gone to many conference sessions that talk about the virtues of participatory design. And our presentation today is very intentionally not that. We don't think we need to sell you on why working with residents on service delivery is important. And what we often feel is lacking from those presentations is the how. How do you actually do it? Because I want to be clear, participatory design is not the easy route. It's not the established norm of how government works. And in fact, there are a lot of government norms that make it actually pretty hard to even try participatory design. So today's session is largely going to be a conversation with our project manager, Swetha, and two of our resident researchers, Francois and Shani, about our first experience with participatory design. So we'll talk about how we did it, which is not necessarily how to do it, but hopefully it gives you some ideas for how you might try your own model out in the future. But before we dive all in, I want to just take a few steps back, tell you a little bit more about who we are, the work that we did, and just orient you to where our story starts. So Kiana gave us a quick overview, but what is the lab at DC? We are a design and research team in the DC Office of the City Administrator. We've got civic designers, data scientists, and social scientists, and we work with our fellow agencies to address the issues that matter most to our residents. So our work draws from human-centered design, sometimes also randomized evaluations, predictive modeling, data analysis, usually some combination of all of these. And we support the over 70 agencies and 30,000 employees across district government. So this is where our story starts. In 2022 and 2023, the district got funding to provide more than 5,000 new permanent supportive housing vouchers to residents. That's the largest ever 2-year increase that we've seen. Just to give you a sense of scale, the district usually adds about 200 to 300 new housing vouchers each year. And like the name implies, these vouchers will permanently cover about 70% of an individual or a family's private market rent, so long as they remain eligible. Permanent supportive housing vouchers are an essential tool in our city for addressing chronic homelessness. But we haven't gotten these 5,000 vouchers out the door as fast as there has been demand. Our administrative infrastructure was never built for this volume. And so, as I had said, 200 to 300 per year translates into a volume of about a 700% increase in the number of vouchers in the city in those last 2 years. So that's where our conversations started with our fellow DC government agencies. In the fall of 2022, we started talking with the DC Department of Human Services, DHS, and the DC Housing Authority, DCHA. Those are the two agencies responsible for connecting residents with vouchers. Go to the next slide. So the question that we centered on was, how can we work together to improve the housing voucher experience and house residents more quickly? One idea that the Housing Authority floated right away was to revise the application paperwork. We did do that. That's another presentation, and our colleagues actually gave that at Code for America's Form Fest a few months ago. So if you're interested in hearing about the form revision process, that recording is online. You can go check that out. What we also talked about with our partners was taking the time to do some discovery work with residents and to learn more about their experiences with the housing voucher process. But instead of just talking to residents, we floated the idea of working with residents sort of throughout the entire life cycle of the project. So we proposed to our agency partners the idea of hiring residents with lived experience to join our team for a few months. And they were on board. And we wanted residents to join our team to both not only shape the research agenda and lead interviews, shadows, and focus groups, but together we also hosted co-design sessions with the public to generate ideas for improving service delivery. And then finally, these same residents worked with us to prioritize the next steps that the district would take to make the customer experience of this program better. So with our agency partners on board, we set to planning everything. And then just about a couple months in, the DC Housing Authority received a pretty hefty audit report from HUD. It wasn't pretty. We head to the next slide. Suddenly, our team found ourselves being asked by district leaders in both the executive and legislative branch, hey, lab, aren't you working on housing vouchers? How quickly can you deliver on X, Y, Z? The pressure that our agency partners already felt just increased. And the lab kind of found ourselves in these conversations as well. Leadership wanted results really fast and for very good reason, right? We all want residents to receive the services that we've allocated for them, and we want our residents housed. But our project team's sort of steady approach that we had been planning now had this new added urgency to it. We were committed to doing what we set out to do, but now we were doing it even faster. So with that as our backdrop, I am going to let our team take it from here and pivot us just to an open discussion. And we will transition off the slides. And I'm going to start with Shawnee. Let's start with just the obvious question. How did you hear about the resident researcher position and what made you want to apply?
Sure. I learned about the resident researcher position via a flyer I received in my email. I actually applied because I knew I could give great insight about my experience navigating through the housing voucher application process. In addition to that, I also wanted to gain knowledge about the work required to complete a research project. Ultimately, I was hoping to impact a positive change within the system and to simply become part of a team.
And Francois, from your experience, why did you decide to apply for the program and how did you hear about it?
I heard about the program through someone that I worked with when I was a peer educator during COVID. So I received the email from her, and she told me about the program, and I figured, I would try to make a difference, and learn some things. So.
Great. Now, Swetha, as the project manager, can you just give us sort of an overview? We worked on this for 4 months. What did that look like with our team, sort of the highlights?
Yeah, so we first started by hiring our resident researchers. That was 5 people for about 5 to 7 hours a week for 4 months. And once our resident researchers were hired, we began by doing some training, like on key design thinking methods and research methods, like interviews, focus groups, and shadowing. And then we also started to set some research goals with our team. So thinking about what are the things we wanted to learn during this research period. So that involved a lot of group discussion. And also we did a journey mapping exercise together to identify and prioritize some of those biggest pain points in the resident experience in getting a voucher. And then we did the research. So we did some observations, focus groups, interviews with residents, case managers, landlords, and DC government staff involved in the voucher program. And from there, we had a room with a bunch of sticky notes and started to identify some of the common challenges that we learned about across those various methods. And then we held 4 co-design sessions with residents, case managers, landlords, and DC government staff, where we started to collaborate on what are some solutions to those challenges we learned about. And then finally, after the co-design sessions, we synthesized the solutions that came out of that as a team and prioritized them, thinking about like what are the solutions that would have the highest impact for DC residents. And then finally, we presented our findings to district leadership and then incorporated them into a very comprehensive report.
Great, thanks for that overview. So I know both Shani and Francois spoke about getting flyers and sort of hearing through their networks about the position, but can you talk about what recruitment was like from our side and what we actively did?
Yeah, recruitment was a big effort. So we first developed a lot of recruitment material. So that was like email communications, a position description, flyers, and also like an actual application form for people to apply for the position. And then we also conducted extensive outreach to community-based organizations, asking them to forward the announcement to whoever they thought might be a good fit. We also presented at the Interagency Council on Homelessness, which has various working groups. So we like advertised the position there. And then I think we had like 2 or 3 webinars that we advertised at shelters as well. So people could join that and learn more about the position. And then we ended up receiving 70 applications, which was amazing. And then from there, we narrowed it down to a list of about 10 people to interview. And then from there, we selected 5 residents to join our team.
Great. And so Francois and Shani, we'll start with you, Francois. When you got your invitation from the lab to join, what made you decide, yeah, this is something I want to do?
I just wanted the opportunity to do something, impactful. I figured, maybe there might be an opportunity to try to learn the process and to try to make an impact, to try to change something, make things better.
Yeah. And Shani, how about you?
Sure. I actually accepted a position from the lab because during the interview process, the purpose and process of the research project was explained. I also believe that building partnerships can add value and fill gaps between the government and its constituents.
Yeah, that was certainly what we're hoping to do. So Francois, can you talk us through a little bit about the training and sort of onboarding period, right? We didn't sort of jump right into conducting research, but we had a couple of weeks of training and planning, and maybe give a little bit of overview from your perspective, what those topics were and what you learned.
From my perspective, I think it was like a bit of a crash course in how to do, research, analysis, how to take notes and do interviews, how to do what co-design is, what being a resident researcher actually entails, stuff like that. Um, I think it was pretty good. I wish there was a little bit more time, but considering the time constraints that we had.
Yeah, and I think when we went into this project from the lab's perspective, we didn't think that we were necessarily training residents in a really robust, course on research methods. But what surprised you when you started doing the work?
Let's see. And how a lot of the findings I discovered through all the sessions, the interviews, the shadowing, and the focus groups that we did. I noticed a lot of similarities about how agencies weren't really that were involved in the housing voucher process weren't really communicating with each other and with the clients, with the applicants, how all the stakeholders weren't really being helped by various agencies.
Yeah, I know in one of our co-design sessions, I think you found yourself at a table with mostly landlords. And can you describe what they were talking about? And, that might have been a new experience, I think.
The landlords were basically saying that they didn't get any support from DCHA basically, and I was really surprised by that because landlords, being that landlords are the major stakeholders in the whole thing. I mean, they're the ones that who have the properties that provide the housing. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Shawnee, maybe you could just describe one of the research activities that you participated in. What did that look like?
Sure. One of the research activities that I participated in was the actual focus group. And I actually facilitated. It was fun, very exciting. Um, I think the biggest challenge was trying to get the landlords to register. I'm not sure if it was fear or just they weren't as interested as we had hoped. I would say our discussions actually involved what was working well and what could use improvement. Um, so at our focus group sessions, there was actually two resident researchers. We had the lab staff, and then we had case managers from core service agencies and landlords. Um, and some of the topics that were revealed as far as what could use improvements, certain things such as language barriers, the understaffing, the outdated system and or software sometimes that required the resubmission of applications when a small edit was all that was required, um, insufficient documentation, as well as the application having repetitive questions. And then, of course, I think the biggest complaint that we heard was the enormous length of the application. We also focused on some of the positive things that were actually working, and that consists of knowledgeable staff in reference to the various housing voucher programs and their applications, as well as accessibility to clients, and then just the dedication and commitment from the staff because they were so short-staffed that we made sure we applauded them in the type of dedication, that they offered, not just for the city, but for the constituents surrounding housing.
Thank you for that. And Francois, I know you tended to focus, I think, with the shadowing team. Can you talk about what that looked like?
We shadowed a DHS employee who basically reviewed the DCHA applications and corrected mistakes and whatnot, and they basically forwarded the application over to DCHA. So I learned a lot from that experience, and how they do things and how they what they were able to do, and from the employee herself, her frustrations and her challenges, in dealing with things.
Yeah. I want to pivot a little bit to logistics, because again, folks who are listening who might want to try to replicate participatory design in their own work, you might be asking, how do we pay people? That is always a difficult thing in government. So Sweetha, I know we've talked about this is the first time the lab did this, and we set the stage that things were happening really fast. But can you talk us through what the options were that we were weighing for our hiring structure? And then ultimately, what did we choose and why?
Yeah, so this was tricky. So we really wanted to work with residents. We knew that was like a non-starter, but we also had to balance this like really tight timeline and pressure. And then I think as a team, like we ultimately prioritized speed, which I don't know if was the right thing to do, but it's what we did then. And because we prioritized speed, it meant we had to make a lot of decisions about hiring fast. And one of those was whether or not we wanted to hire people through like DC HR processes or work through like an existing contract vehicle with a community-based organization. And because the lab has hired people and has experience with DCHR, we knew that would take a lot of time. And so because of that, we decided, let's use an existing contract that DHS has to pay and hire our resident researchers. And there were pros and cons to this setup. This mechanism of working through a community-based organization, it did allow us to act quickly and recruit, hire, and onboard our resident researchers within the span of 5 weeks. But it meant that we had to rely like on a third party to pay our resident researchers, which we didn't have control over.
Can you give us an example of what that lack of control of payment looked like?
Yeah, so like for even before the first paycheck came in, we were discussing with the community-based organization and like having a little bit of difficulty agreeing on like having the paychecks delivered in a preferred payment method, so like direct deposit versus paper check. And so there was a lot of back and forth to allow for checks to be delivered in a preferred method. And then when it came to the first paycheck, it was delayed, which was really frustrating. And that required, like the community-based organization asked if people could come pick up their checks at the location. And when people went there, the checks weren't ready. And like another example is like tax season recently happened and like 1099s didn't show up on time. And that also involved extensive follow-up. So like I say this to say like these are real things that happen and they really erode trust. And that makes our job hard to do. And so I think that's something you have to consider when thinking about like setting up a hiring structure and how you end up paying people.
Yeah. And I know this group has talked about some alternatives. You laid out one, right? Going through more traditional like hiring processes through your HR department. Francois, are there other things that folks should consider that are different from a traditional hiring or paying people as contractors?
I figure, maybe a like a training stipend of some kind. Um, Perhaps gift cards or having debit cards, like one of those debit cards where one can actively, direct deposit, the funds onto, as the program goes along, stuff like that, instead of having to use use a provider like a CBO.
Right. So Sweetha, there were a lot of people to coordinate. We talked about, we've hired 5 residents. We had 5 lab staff assigned to this project. And then of course there were the people that we met with through interviews, focus groups, shadowing, co-design. How did the scheduling of all of this work and any lessons learned?
Yeah, this was like a really big thing to think about, like a jigsaw puzzle. So like one thing I'll mention is that there was an inherent time imbalance. So the team members at the lab, we were all like full-time employees with 40 hours a week. And that meant like we had more flexibility to just like schedule a meeting 2 days later. But that's not fair to make the same assumption of our resident researchers. And so I think looking back, maybe we could have advertised the position a little bit more differently and like maybe have more set times, like we'll meet every Tuesday from 10 to 12. And that would have saved a lot of time having to like schedule the next meeting during a meeting itself. Another thing is that we were thinking like we want to be flexible because people might have different schedules. So we wanted to have a mix of like independent work and group work. But I think as the process went on, we learned that we really thrived better when we were in person as a group working together. Like we were able to better collaborate effectively and move things further along. So that was another thing we had to consider is like, what's the right balance of independent work and group work and collaborating?
And I know there was this super in the weeds here, but we had some trouble too with just like with tools, right? So devices and access to files and things like that. This is again really in the weeds, but for people who are planning to do this, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I think looking back, that's something I wish I had thought about before, like even embarking on this, is like tools are so important in terms of how we collaborate in this day and age. And like just simple things like sharing files, right? Like we couldn't share DC SharePoint links to resident researchers because they weren't DC employees. So we had to think about like what are alternative file sharing methods. So we ended up using Box, but Box wasn't the most user friendly, and it was like sometimes hard to access the links, and that was a bit challenging. And then I think like using virtual tools like this means like you can take a call from anywhere, but if you don't have like a reliable internet connection, that can make it hard too. And so I think looking back, what we could have done is maybe like arrange for some laptops and like desk spaces in the office, so that people who don't necessarily have that set up at home can like come to the office whenever and like use that moving forward.
Great, thanks for that. So I want to pivot to something that's a little difficult. We started this project with 5 resident researchers and we ended with 3. And I know in at least one case, this work just proved to be too emotionally heavy for one of our resident researchers. So Shani, are you willing to share some of your observations and thoughts about that?
Sure. You're right. This topic is challenging. I think you guys did a great job with offering us mental health support. The websites were very, very useful. And you guys had an open door policy where we can share what was actually going on, either with our current housing issues or just in our everyday life. So I think that, people's current experiences always show up in their work life. And sometimes that does make it challenging to participate. Housing stability is a trauma, and working on a project like this can resurface those feelings. There also were some very real trust issues. The relationship, I would say, between DC government and constituents, especially housing participants, it's a very touchy subject. The trust is almost non-existent. And I think with our team moving so fast, and for some, it just made it hard for them to be confident with real change, and if it was actually going to happen.
I appreciate that honesty. And I know speed is a theme that we've come up now in a couple of the questions, but what would more time on this project have looked like in your opinion? What would have been ideal?
I think because housing is so complex, and in order for not just us, but the city and every agency that we worked with on this project, in order for us to get the most benefit, projects such as these, they should last at least a year. And I would say with approximately 7 to 10 hours a week.
Yeah. So more in depth and breadth. Yeah.
Yes, both, yes.
Thanks. I want to keep spending a little bit more time on this topic of trust, because I know when this group was preparing for this presentation today, I was caught off guard when Francois and Shani, you shared that you wouldn't have been particularly eager to apply for this position if it had been hosted by our housing agency partners, and that the fact that it was hosted by the lab felt different. And I think that's really important for us to talk about, because unfortunately, as you just said, Shani, government has harmed people, and trust isn't always there. So Francois, what can government, this is a big question, but what can government do to repair these relationships? Or just to put it another way, what would you want to see from a government agency to be willing to consider working with them as a resident researcher?
Oh, that is a complex question, but to sum up, to quote the founder of Code for America, Miss Jennifer Palka, government is still based on a rigid structure in which the elites dictate policy from above, but they're disconnected from the people that they're supposed to serve. So basically, government needs to be more responsive, in my opinion. And each person is an individual with separate needs, and desires and abilities, and government should show more empathy, sincerity, eagerness, and respect, when you meet with residents. The reason I would have been hesitant if it were DCHA or DHS wanting to have resident researchers, I would have thought it would have just felt strange to me, in my opinion, because yes, there's that trust issue. It just would have seemed like a, hate to say it, a PR stunt, sort of like a cover up or whitewashing in a sense, because are you really trying to reform or change things, or are you just seeming like it?
Yeah. What does it look like when government actually shows up for someone? Have you had an experience where you're like, this is a standard that I'd like to see replicated every time I interact with my government?
When I recertified with DCHA, they actually have a customer service office, a center where you can go in, you can walk in, and meet with someone. And I was able to meet with someone with my recertification documents, and she was able to walk me through everything, answer my questions. She was able to notarize and certify everything. And it was a good interaction, so professional, it was a good experience.
Yeah.
Experience I like to see more of, from government in general, not just DCHA.
Sure. I think it's a good reminder that every touch point with a government service is an opportunity to demonstrate that trust. Even if it's not the service, that we're talking about, residents really experience government as a single entity, right? So when we finished our discovery work, we kind of got to the end of these 4 months. We had our findings together. We had the opportunity to present to both the Housing Authority and Human Services leadership, as well as the city administrator. What was that like for you? I'll start with you, Shawnee.
It was exciting. I really felt like we had gathered all this data and we were just ready to fly with it. I think the most memorable moment, I would say, is the openness and transparency from the city administrator. I honestly was not expecting that from him just because of government, but I mean, he changed my view on, escalating things and bringing things to government's attention and how to do it. I think we gave an awesome presentation. He was impressed. He said it himself. I felt complete.
Thank you. Francois, what about you? Not most residents utilizing the voucher program have the opportunity to have an audience with the directors of these agencies or leadership of our city. What did that feel like?
I would have to agree with Shawnee. I mean, yes, it felt like I was being heard. The city administrator was being responsive, quite responsive. We also, presented our findings to the leadership at DCHA and DHS, and I felt that we were heard there too. Yeah.
So the report that Shawnee and Francois are referring to is public. It's on our website, the lab.dc.gov. And if you follow sort of projects to our housing page, you should be able to find it there if you're curious to see the contents of the report and more details about the actual work that we did. We continue to deliver on some of the things that were named in that report with our partners across government agencies. But there's still a ton in there that has yet to happen. And I want to ask you, Shawnee, just how could we have scoped this work differently so that residents feel more improvements sooner?
More time. Again, I know we said this a lot, but time is of the essence, and we just didn't get enough of it. There was so much more information and data that I'm sure we could have compiled. We could have really strategized and changed things, around. So I would just really stress more time. In addition to that, I would say making time specifically to do things, to implement the findings from our research. And then just having more formal commitments from our agency partners to follow through with the findings. And this could look like having an agency staff person join the core team, and then maybe both a frontline staff person and a high-level agency decision maker.
Yeah, I agree. So kind of a quick lightning round to close us out before we transition to questions from those listening. And this is for everyone. Why should government hire more resident researchers? I'm going to start with you, Francois.
Government should hire more resident researchers because we have insight and experience that otherwise that government employees, agencies, staff otherwise wouldn't have. Residents will have more trust if you engage, with them more. So I think that's why people need to be more. The people that are being served should be, should have more engagement with the government.
Great. Swetha?
I think government should work with residents because like in government, as public servants, we're in this privileged position of creating or impacting policies, programs, products, and processes that affect constituent well-being. And, people in government, we're working hard, but we don't always have the full picture. And so I think working with residents like we did with this can guide kind of those downstream effects of those policies and processes on the resident experience. Like, I really think working with residents keeps you honest about the downstream effects of the policies you're creating, and that your work will have higher impact when residents are also part of the process of doing that work with you.
Great. And Shawnee, to close us.
Sure. I believe government should hire more resident researchers because lived experience is vital to this work. Ultimately, residents can bring critical eye to see gaps that the government just can't.
I appreciate it. So thank you to all of our panelists. I'm going to transition us now to questions from attendees. I see we've already got a couple in the chat, so I will just take them in the order that they're coming. And if you have a question, please feel free to drop it in the Q&A section below, and we will try to address as many as we can. So the first question, what role did the participatory users play on the team? What were they responsible for? So if I'm going to ask if you would take that.
Yeah, but then I also want to throw it to Francois and Shawnee to hear their perspective too on your primary responsibilities. But at least when we envisioned the role, there was kind of two functions. So one was to support in decision making. So that's thinking about like, what are the challenges we want to prioritize? Who should we talk to? Like, what research methods should we use? Like things down to like, where should we meet with people? Like decision making was a big part of the role. And then the second part of the role was actually doing the research itself. So like leading interviews, leading focus groups, like sitting in on observations, like developing insights and like participating in analysis and synthesis sessions and helping us identify those patterns. So I would say like from a big picture, that's like what the two primary responsibilities we envisioned for resident researchers were. Yeah.
Francois or Shani, anything you want to add about your roles?
We were able to show share our experiences, our personal stories about the whole housing voucher process. We were shown, you know, the actual process, sort of like sort of like a roadmap um, um, of how the process is supposed to go, but we were able to step in and show that it really doesn't work the way it's supposed to, and address the gaps, the lapses in information and goals and how long it takes, all that stuff. The stuff that you wouldn't usually get if you're just, you know, you just wouldn't get that otherwise.
Shani, anything you
Sure.
want to add?
Yeah, sure. I would say it's the same thing. We play, well, I'll speak for myself. I played two roles. So I played the role of a student and a teacher. And being a student, every day participating, I had to remind myself of the commitment I made. So days where I was just tired, I was overwhelmed. Um, Even when I was down, it didn't feel like, you know, this was really going to bring about a difference. I just remembered the commitment that I made to myself and just trying to change the system. Um, but I learned so much. Like Francois just said, just the mapping of the dedication that it takes to get one piece of data. I mean, it's enormous. And unless you're a part of this team or this type of team, you have no idea what it takes. And then the other role as a teacher was just giving you guys so much information that you weren't aware of. Um, and the small processes and sometimes delays that unless you go through it, you really don't believe it happens. So, I mean, it was a forthcoming role that I felt like I deserved, but I had to step up. This you couldn't take this lightly, and I'm glad I made it to the end.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Shani, because I think, yeah, our team was trying to bring our expertise in navigating government and how to do, research methodology. And our resident researchers were there teaching us right alongside, like, this is actually how this program works. This is what it feels like to be on the receiving end. And so I think, it was hopefully mutually beneficial in that sense. I'm gonna take the next question, which is from Morgan. I'm curious if you can share what some of the considerations were in the selection process to get from 70 candidates to 5 researchers. I know we had a giant spreadsheet, Swetha. Do you recall some of the questions we asked on the application?
You're gonna have to help me jog my memory a little bit, but I think in our application form, we were looking for like curiosity, like a willingness to learn. That was probably like one of the biggest qualities because this was a discovery project. And just also previous experience in like communicating, both like written and verbal. That was like a critical factor there too. And then yeah, like we did get around 70 applications, and I remember we had to like think through some of selection criteria. So I remember one thing we were thinking about was like, does the person have like a locally funded voucher versus a federal voucher? Because to be honest, I don't think we were expecting 70 applications. And so we had to start like narrowing down the list a little bit. And because our scope was focused on the locally funded voucher program, that was kind of a selection criteria. Carissa, what else did we consider? I'm trying to like visualize the spreadsheet in my head, but it's a little
Yeah,
hard.
I think in addition to the federal versus locally funded voucher distinction, we were also trying to focus on people who are already matched with a voucher. And in DC language, matched means that you have been, a voucher has been allocated for you. You still need to apply and be deemed eligible to receive it, but that is the sort of first step. And we had quite a few applicants who were not at that step yet, who were in our rapid rehousing program. And so, we decided again, while their input would have also been useful, because we were just so overwhelmed with interest, we decided to focus on folks who already were in the voucher process. Our next question is from Helen. How do you balance engaging the housing authority for buy-in to implement research findings and the distrust that including them creates in participatory design? Oof, that's a tricky one. Anyone want to start?
Yeah. I mean, as far as the buy-in is concerned, I look at it as generally in business, you have to consider the balance between the consumer and the other stakeholders. And what I'm trying to say is, you know how it seems like every time you get a service or every business always want to give you a survey.
Mhm.
I think in a way this research a resident researcher thing is sort of like an extension of that. Instead of just giving someone a survey to fill out where they can rate from 1 to 10, do you agree or disagree, or do you like this or not? You can actually talk to the person and get their experience. You can actually the person can actually have sort of like a shared relationship, a stakeholder in that particular business or agency, where they actually can try to implement some changes, you know, in that way. It's almost like it's almost like a return on investment, because government is essentially a business.
Mhm.
Most people don't really believe that, but government is a business. It's a corporation just like any other. And the stakeholders are the taxpayers, and they want a return on their investment. So if government is not being efficient and is not providing the services that they're supposed to provide, they're not getting a return on their investment. So that has to be addressed. In any other business, the business would go out of business. They wouldn't make any profit, and the shareholders would be concerned. But in government, it doesn't seem to work that way, you know? So that's the only way in my opinion, how I explain it.
Yeah. I think, one thing we have talked about this as a team, and one thing I would add is having more agency, I don't want to even say buy-in, but participation in the same way that this core group met and spoke on a weekly basis. We had buy-in from the Housing Authority and the Department of Human Services, and we did meet. I should say the lab staff met with them on a different cadence, but having a staff person from those agencies be part of this core team, I think would have changed the nature of the work. And so that's something I would do differently next time around. And then quite candidly, not just one person, multiple people, because we've seen a lot of staff turnover, especially at the Housing Authority. And so one of our champions is no longer there. And that has meant, creating new relationships. So trying to think strategically about bringing those folks in right in the weeds with us for the whole process, and having at multiple levels, frontline staff all the way up to high level decision makers in the agency is what I would add. I want to keep us moving because we have time for just a couple more questions, and I'm going to do my best to get through them. One person has asked, I'm curious if this process gave you any insights into how to make these types of positions more permanent. It's a great question. Also something the lab has talked about. Swetha?
Yeah. I think, yeah, we were thinking about it, and then like budget realities maybe got in the way a little bit. But one thing we were thinking about how to like make this more permanent down the road is like submitting a budget enhancement request to like have like a dedicated source of funding to work with residents. And we started to think a lot about like ways we could use that money, like what's the structure. So we hired 5 people, 5 to 7 hours a week for 4 months, but we were thinking about what are other alternative ways we can engage residents continuously, whether that's like bringing them on for different parts of the design process, like at interviews and user testing. And so that's one thing we were thinking about, is just like both finding that permanent source of funding through our regular budget process, and then thinking about how we would deploy those funds to work with residents on a more sustainable, like ongoing, consistent way.
Yeah. Jim asked this question: what kinds of things did you learn in the research that you think you would not have learned if staff researchers, I'll say lab researchers, had done this work instead of resident researchers? So I thought maybe I can put that to you.
Yeah, I think Francois brought this up. There are just like gaps in the resident experience that we would have never known otherwise. Like, I really don't think we could have done this work without our resident researchers, because our knowledge of that resident experience, like I'm visualizing the journey map, and it's like customer experience, back end actions, like pain points, like that top row is essentially missing in the conversations we had been having before onboarding our resident researchers. And so as Francois mentioned, like they were just able to provide us insights into the gaps of our knowledge, particularly when it comes to like the pain points residents were experiencing.
I agree. And I would say, as somebody who led a mapping exercise with both agencies, there's missing gaps, not because their information is being withheld, but simply because they don't know, or we expect, or we assume this is how the process works because this is the piece I do. But it wasn't, I think, until we showed those maps to our residents, they were like, well, that's not exactly how that went, or this, but if this happens, then, you're going to go off on a whole nother branch of this map. So very invaluable gut checks, I think we have time for just about one more. So I'm going to take the next one in the list. This is from Thomas. It sounds like you did a bunch of different research methods, interviews, focus groups, etc. What methods were the most effective and which were the least? Francois, I'm gonna ask you. I know, actually, I'm not sure if we had you. I know you were on the shadowing team. There were some shadows that we had planned that didn't come through. I don't know if you recall that, but if you could speak to that process.
From the shadowing process, I was able to learn, like I mentioned earlier, the viewpoint from the staff member, how they were able to process the applications and focus groups. We were able to get every input from everyone. All the stakeholders, landlords, the social workers, the case managers, and the residents, from basically from everyone. From the interviews, we were able to interview some people from both DHS and DCHA. Which ones will be more effective? I think there should have been more focus groups. And I think there should have been more interviews with more, there should have been more shadowing and more interviews. Yeah, also, yeah, more input from the public also.
Okay. Shawnee, I'm gonna give you the chance to have the last word. Anything you would add about what you would have done differently in terms of our research methods?
I'll go back to more time. So if we had more time, we could do more groups. We could do more interviews. We could have more input, from the public, from stakeholders. We could have done so much more with just more time.
I hear you.
Yeah.
And speaking of time, I know we are at it, so I'm gonna turn it back to Kiana to close us out. And thank you all for joining us.
All right, thank you so much for this insightful and invigorating conversation. It was really great, and I appreciate the honesty and vulnerability that all the panelists shared during their portion. Also, I just wanted to give a quick note. Let me share my screen. That you can find more information about the lab at DC on X, formerly known as Twitter. Their tag is the lab_DC. You can also follow Code for America for more info about events, webinars, and happenings here at Code for America. And also for more content like this, join us for our Code for America Summit in Oakland, California. Our theme this year is building a new digital age that works for all. On May 28th, we will have 4 pre-summit workshops leading up to our main event. And on May 29th and 30th, we'll come together to discuss all the ways that emerging technologies will transform government and how we can ensure they are used in ethical ways that promote equity and serve all people with dignity and respect. Tickets are selling fast and our just-in-time pricing ends on April 19th, and we hope to see you there. Once again, thank you to the lab at DC, Carissa, and all the panelists, and all of you for attending, and we hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.